Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, planting the seeds for BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard Evaluation with Lori, Inez, and Alex. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we get into today's discussion, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarain Squawkin. I'm Syilx Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory, Apache, and Belgian on my father's side. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. Working behind the scenes is our production coordinator, Cynthia. She'll be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. So please make sure to look after yourself. And if at any point in time you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or a family member, don't hesitate to do so. We'll have some prompts in the chat for you if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our guests to introduce themselves.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks for having us. So I'm going to pass to Inez, who is the niece of the elder that we were hoping to have with us today, Elder Wendy Ritchie, who's been super important to this project. And Wendy was unexpectedly unable to be here today. So Inez has graciously offered to open us up. So Inez, over to you.
Pasiam Tisiaya, Lacheltanot Tosqui, Talitzaquasco Kale Samath, Musqueam Tutanwasanabing. Well and good day, everybody. My name is Inez Lewis. My family name is Point, and I'm from the Scoquel First Nation here in one of the many villages of the Upriver Stelo people, and want to first acknowledge that I am standing in on behalf of my aunt, Tsimia, one of the many moms in my family who is our matriarch and was unable to join and sent her regrets as she's tending to some important family business at this time. Here to offer a prayer and start in a good way, and to acknowledge all the folks who are joining us from all over, bringing their minds and their hearts in the space of learning. And as I share the prayer, I just ask that you pray in your own way, acknowledging that everybody joins the spirit or energy in their own way of believing and thinking, just taking that time to center yourself. Good grandmothers, good grandfathers, creator of all good things, we thank you for this day. We humbly ask you for the strength and knowledge as we open our minds and hearts to this good learning and this good work in space. As we acknowledge the work ahead of us is heavy and deep, we ask you to give us the strength in this learning as we learn new ways of knowing. We gain new tools as we learn how to use them and integrate them into ourselves and our spirit and our work. We humble ourselves before you as we acknowledge that we are weak and need assistance, and we need help so that we can gain the strength as we move forward together in unity, Letzamat, one mind and one heart, so that we can gain strength together. We ask you to send prayers to those in sickness and sorrow, those in the hospital, suffering with illness, those on the streets that are suffering with substance misuse, those that are struggling, that don't have homes, and those that need the connection for healing and growth. We ask you to give us the strength that we can help these people in our work. Osiam, all my relations. So wishing you all a good session today. Lots of great things coming your way, and thanking you again for the invitation to welcome you all to start the work in a good way on behalf of my aunt, Tsimia. Awesome, and I'll join you at the end.
Thanks, Inez. We really appreciate it. All right, so I think we can get started with our slides now. Cynthia's going to pull those up. Amazing. So this is Elder Wendy, who's not able to join us. She's been an incredible member of this project team and was the project elder. So just really our hearts are with her and her family right now. I'm Lori. I'm a settler of mixed European ancestry and calling in from the unceded traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. And I was the project lead for this work. So I'll pass to Alex to introduce himself.
Thanks, Laurie. My name's Alex. I'm calling in today from the traditional unceded territories of the Lheidli-T'enneh, was colonially known as Prince George. I'm the senior data analyst on the quality team and clinical quality, and supported this project with Laurie as one of the project team members.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex. So we'll get into the content now. So we have the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard is what we're going to be talking about today. So Cynthia, if you don't mind just going to the next slide, that would be awesome. Beautiful. If we were in person, I'd ask you all to raise your hands if you'd heard of the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard before, but I can't actually see any of you. So I'll do a little bit of an overview to see, just make sure we're all on the same page. So the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard is actually the first of its kind in Canada and actually the world, and was developed to address longstanding issues of Indigenous specific racism in the healthcare system that we all know about. And so the Health Standards Organization creates these standards. And what an HSO standard is a published document that indicates evidence-based criteria and guidelines to support and promote the quality and safety across healthcare services. And so in partnership with the Health Standards Organization, the First Nations Health Authority launched the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Non-Assessment Standard in June of 2022. And this work was overseen by an Indigenous-led technical committee with balanced representation across various expert groups, including people with lived experience, policymakers, product users like frontline providers and clinical team leads, and general interest groups like academics. And so the standard applies across First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples' health and wellness journey across the health system and uses a distinctions-based approach to ensure that the unique needs of each of these groups are considered throughout the standard. And so, as we all know, systemic racism is a problem in our healthcare system. And while the work of the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard began before the publication of In Plain Sight, the report recognized the importance of this work, and Recommendation 8 of In Plain Sight specifically asked for a BC assessment standard to be adopted in BC. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear a lot about cultural safety and humility, and so we just wanted to make sure that we're all kind of speaking the same language on what that means. And so the difference between cultural safety and cultural humility is that cultural safety is an outcome and cultural humility is a lifelong process. And cultural safety really needs to be determined by the individual who's actually receiving the care. So only when an Indigenous individual tells us that a healthcare interaction is culturally safe, can we say that it is. And this also means that for each individual, their experiences and what they consider safe may differ greatly and differ over time. Cultural humility, on the other hand, is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. And so we all need to be on this cultural safety and humility journey for our entire lives. And you'll hear us talk a lot about how we had to sit in our cultural humility journeys throughout developing this method. And it was an ongoing process of redefining what this work would look like to make sure that we were staying true to the concept of cultural humility throughout this work. And so we actually have a beautiful documentary that we can share. Cynthia's just going to pull it up. And so this documentary is 11 minutes long, and you'll hear from Elder Jerry Ullman, who was the technical committee co-chair, about how he feels that this standard is really meeting some of the needs of the systemic racism that we know is in our system, and also from health leaders from FNHA and the Health Standards Organization. So Cynthia, if you could just pull up that video, we will show it now.
I think a lot of people feel more comfortable believing that racism is something that happened in the past. What we hear on an almost daily basis from the First Nations people and communities that we serve is that racism is alive and well.
Racism has been understood to be part of the implications of health service delivery and of the outcomes of health service delivery. by First Nations people really for many, many years.
Examples of that could be when a First Nations person shows up in an emergency room and the automatic assumption is that they are under the influence of either alcohol or some type of substance.
The reality is that a high number of First Nations people are highly abstinent from all alcohol and drugs. So when you're treated with the example of how often do you use alcohol, and when was the last time you used alcohol, and are you sure, then that becomes quite insulting and quite disconcerting.
Practitioners are very unwilling to consider that the person may want traditional healing, parts of ceremony or culture included as part of the treatment plan for their health concern. And so people often leave that situation feeling that they haven't been heard, that they don't have many options available to them, and of course then they don't receive the standard of care that any other person would receive. One of the reasons why we have gaps in health status, different measures of health status, is because people are reluctant to seek care because they know personally of someone who has been treated or mistreated or untreated in the healthcare system due to racism.
And so you would have, people going to the doctor who were in stage, 2 or 3 or even 4, stage 4 cancer, having hesitated or waited until they could wait no longer to seek health care.
It's only been probably a matter of weeks since I experienced a racist incident myself. So it happens all the time, and that's why it's so important that we continue to work extremely hard to eliminate it from the health system. In order to actually achieve cultural safety, we had to have an instrument to operationalize or to give health organizations some concrete ideas and actions as to how they could start on their own cultural safety journey.
I think standards need to be formalized because you need to have a minimum requirement of great health care no matter where you go in the system, whether you're going to your physician's office, to an urgent primary care center, or the emergency, or long-term care. There should be standards of care that are expected across the board, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a doctor, whether you're an LPN. People should be expected to receive excellent care, and they need to be held accountable if they're not delivering that care.
It was really important that we conducted ourselves in a cultural way in developing the standards, so we opened every meeting with a song and some ceremony.
So before I went to the first meeting, I looked up the meaning standard in a dictionary. It actually refers to a flag that the army would carry onto the field of battle. And they'd all rally around that flag. So when I went to the meeting, my first meeting, I said, we're developing a document that people can rally around in this war against racism.
So the two key partners were, of course, First Nations Health Authority and the different people, individuals involved in cultural safety and humility across the organization, and the Health Standards Organization. So they have a lot of experience in developing different kinds of standards.
The Cultural Safety and Humility Standard is the first of its kind in Canada, and it really represents an important step in the journey of addressing Indigenous-specific racism and discrimination. The standard was developed by a 16-person Indigenous-led technical committee, individuals with really diverse perspectives and experience, that looked at evidence and research and reports from Indigenous scholars and academics, bringing together all the perspectives and ideas about how to shape the environment for care that is culturally safe for all.
We did use a distinctions-based approach because every, large group, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, has different health concerns at times, different priorities, different ways of looking at cultural safety and approaching their health.
A really critical step in the development of the standard is the public review process. And that involves putting out the draft of the standard to the public to read, respond to, provide their ideas. And in this instance, over 1,000 people from coast to coast to coast responded to that call for input. And the technical committee did amazing work of reviewing all of that and incorporating it along with other evidence and experience into the final version of the standard. So it truly represents all voices.
The actual standard is a document, a roadmap that health and social service organizations in British Columbia could take and start to work on their cultural safety and humility journey if they hadn't already, as a means to eliminating anti-Indigenous specific racism.
What we see is that not every jurisdiction takes the issue of racism in the health system seriously or accepts it. So I would say, first of all, it's making sure that this is understood as a real problem in the health system, but then also really sets a path to really address those shortcomings and deficiencies.
So the standard is like a mirror, and you look at yourself. And you could start to make statements of accountability of harm we've done. And we're going to stop that.
There are 8 different domains in the standard, including areas such as health leadership and governance, health human resources, the actual services that are provided. And under each of those domains, there are a set of criteria that, as I said, organizations can aim for, and under each criteria is a set of guidelines for how that can be achieved.
I think for me, making it a national standard would be wonderful. I think our province of British Columbia is actually quite ahead when it comes to cultural safety and humility. I think we could learn from other areas and communities as well. However, I think as a whole, it would be great if Canada adopted this standard.
First Nations people across Canada suffer the same disparity that we do here in British Columbia. And so having such a strong standard being built here, would potentially serve the rest of Canada.
And so it's vital that we look at ways to build on the learnings and experience from here, apply those in a way that can help ensure culturally safe care everywhere.
I think part of what we need to really foster is a sense of hope, and that sense of hope is built on very specific and concrete steps.
And so moving the standard from a BC standard to a national standard, I think would be really important and ultimately would contribute to better health outcomes for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across the country.
I tell people the winds of change are here. Some of you might just feel a small little breeze, but it's here.
I could listen to Jerry talk all day. Okay, Cynthia, if you don't mind pulling up those slides again. Beautiful. Thank you so much. So as you learned in the video, there's many different health standards organization standards out there. And so before we kind of get into the details of our methods, we really wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the standards, because not all of you will have actually seen the document. So there are kind of four main headings within the standards. So the standard subsection, those are those eight sections that Nell was talking about in the video. And I'll go through them again in the next slide. But also there's clauses, which are more of an introductory statement that's overarching for various criterion. And then the criterion is what we actually were assessing ourselves against. So there's 92 criteria in the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard. And as part of our evaluation of FNHA's alignment with the standard, we went through all 92 of those criteria. So next slide, please. So these are the sections within the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard. So reciprocal accountability, meaningful partnerships, governance and responsible leadership, physical and financial infrastructure, human capacity, culture of quality and safety, culturally safe services, and research and evaluation. So as you'll see, all of these criteria, or all of these sections rather, are really overarching around from the development of an organization to the services that they deliver, the people that they work with within their organization, and even other areas like research and evaluation. So really throughout the system. So one really interesting process for us was to determine which of these sections were the most relevant to our work as a First Nations organization. And this meant that we had to understand our really unique context in this work. And so following a great deal of discussion, we determined that all of the sections needed self-evaluation within FNHA, but that some sections would be specifically for First Nations people, whereas others, like our developing human capacity, where we have Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit staff members, would be looking at all three of those groups in terms of how we can ensure that we're meeting their needs. So why is organizational reflection so important? So we really need to make sure that we're growing and improving over time. And even as Indigenous organizations, we can't assume that we're culturally safe. As I mentioned, cultural humility is that ongoing process of self-reflection, and incredibly important for us to be following that throughout our entire lives. And then, of course, we've learned very well over the last few years, I guess 5 years now, that things like COVID and the toxic drug supply and environmental disasters can really change how we need to work. And there's always going to be new challenges for us to overcome as a system. And so we can't become stagnant in how we do things. We, of course, want to lead by example and encourage others to do the same. And we want to continuously improve and build trust within our organization and with our partners. And I think it's really important to also talk about how this affects us as individuals who all work and live within systems that perpetuate racism. As a settler, we need to make sure that we're continuously looking at our place in this work. And I think that I can speak for Alex and I that we've very much grown throughout this last year of doing this process as individuals, because we've learned so much about what cultural humility means to us through this process. Next slide, please. Sorry, one more. Thank you. So the First Nations Health Authority really took the lead on promoting cultural safety and humility in the healthcare system, and we've been doing that for many years. And as part of being a champion for the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard, we've completed a self-assessment of our own programs, services, policies, and operations to determine that our current alignment with the standard. And as Elder Jerry said in that video, the standard is a way for us to hold up a mirror to ourselves, and that's just what we did. Next slide, please. So this project used four main methods. So we had policy reviews, interviews with staff, surveys, and the use of existing data to determine FNHA's alignment with those 92 criteria of the standard. And these methods were developed by a project team that was situated within our office of our Chief Nursing Office and our quality department, along with Elder Wendy, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here today to share her experiences, and also the CSMIA Change Champion group that are individuals from across the organization and were integral to this work happening. So next slide, please. So we gathered this incredible group of change champions from across the organization, and they were given the name Sisamaya by Elder Wendy. And Sisamaya, in Elder Wendy's words, means bees have a big job in keeping our environment alive and well. They all work together and think alike to protect their queen and home, making sweet honey for all to enjoy. And so she gifted us with this word from Halkomelem language, Sisamaya, because she heard what we were doing as individuals who were all trying to come together from across FNHA to make our own home better and make sure that we are all working together to do that. And so this group really functioned as a safe space for us to work together and break down silos within FNHA, and they were integral to the method development. And we were really happy. We kind of released the opportunity to become a change champion on an all staff meeting. And we didn't really have any idea of how many people were going to want to attend or want to participate. And we were really blown away by the interest and dedication of this group. They spent hours and hours and hours together, really getting into all of the details of those 92 criteria and really bonded. We have the Sisamaya, the bee, has become really important to all of us. And it was also really important for us to close in ceremony because it allowed us to all gather together, share a meal, and participate in that cultural component that really grounds this work. So you'll see photos from our ceremony here. I always think it's funny. It was the only ceremony I've ever seen where they've told us to take our blankets off in the middle of being blanketed because it was like 45 degrees in that longhouse. So that was a unique experience for sure. But it was really incredible for everybody to come together because we had representatives from across all of FNHA, many of whom had never met each other and whose portfolios really don't interact at all. We also had representatives from all 5 of our regional teams, which is really important at FNHA as well. So with that, I will pass to my colleague Alex, who was also part of Sisamaya and the project team member, and he'll talk a little bit about how we developed our methods.
Awesome. Thanks, Lori. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm going to share a bit more about the process that FNHA used in this self-assessment. However, it's really important to note that every organization is different in its structure and size and many other factors. What worked for us in the FNHA might not necessarily work for other organizations or necessarily take the same amount of time. In FNHA's case, the self-assessment took about 10 months for us to complete, and it reached teams from across the organization, as Lori had mentioned, multiple departments, including all 5 of our health regions. We tried to overlap the phases of our project to more quickly and purposefully kind of accomplish our goals as possible. However, it did take a lot of planning and coordination that we're hoping other organizations don't necessarily have to go through such a fulsome process in planning by learning through this process. And that's really why we wanted to make this presentation. So if you go on to the next slide for me. So this table here kind of provides an overview that focuses more on the methods aspect of the project. Initially, the project team drafted indicators that translated the standard criteria into something a little bit more measurable within that FNHA context. We think that this is probably one of the more important aspects of the planning stages because it's basically learning where the standard fits within your organization, in our case, FNHA, and how we can adapt that standard to fit our context in a way that makes things a little more tangible for us. The team also proposed methods that could be used to check these indicators, and then it moved on to basically working with those working groups within the Sisamaya Change Champions Committee, and then through data collection and reporting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those stages. Go on to the next slide for me. Thank you. So the working groups were convened from that Sisamaya Change Champions Committee. So we put out a call for people to participate in working groups that would focus more on specific content areas. So those content areas were the FNHA workforce and human resources, collaboration, engagement and process, policy and governance, and service delivery. We had just some extensive participation from the CSMIA Change Champions. They were very engaged in the process. They were really happy to participate in those working groups. And it took a bit of time. The working groups met for about 3 or 4 hours in 3 or 4 times in 1 or 2 hour meetings. So it took a little bit of time investment, but ultimately what these working groups were responsible for was finalization of the methods and identifying potential sources of information within the organization, such as which policies or documents we should be aware of, and who are going to be the best people to talk to answer any particular interview questions. There's also one other working group that I'm the most fond of because it's the existing FNHA data working group, being the data analyst, but that was a working group of one. It was basically me working to identify which data sets we had within the organization that we could tap into. Next slide, please. Awesome. So what you're seeing here is a little snippet from the methods table that we developed. So the result of the working groups was a finalized methods table that guided our data collection processes. I think there's 92 standard criteria, and coming up with multiple indicators, sometimes multiple indicators per criteria, it was a complicated process. So we had to map it out in a way that made sense to us. So well, me being the data analyst, put it in a table because everything works in Excel in my mind. And we use this basically to guide our processes going forward. So you can see a couple examples here of how we would structure the interview information, the survey questions. You can also see an example there where we indicated an FNHA data review. So what data sources we could tap into and how we would look at it. What you don't see on this table, though, is another column that we've hidden, which is basically indications of who to talk to within the organization. So we tried to keep the process as confidential and anonymous as possible for our participants. But in our methods table, we have an entire column that's dedicated to who are the people that the CSMIA Change Champions and the working groups have indicated as people who we should be talking to get as close to the information possible that we were looking for. I should note too, we're working on ways of sharing this methods table because this is something we get requests a lot from our partner organizations in terms of, we've gone through this methods process, what can we share? We want to share as much as we can. And we're working on how to do that in the best way possible. So right now we're working on publishing or drafting, I should say, an academic article that would include this table so that it could be hosted and hopefully open source too, so openly accessible and everybody can access it. But we still have to work through our own internal processes to make sure that becomes a reality. We move on to the next slide, please. Awesome. So basically we had about 4 components for our actual data collection. One of the big ones was an all staff survey. So this survey was a collection of about 21 to 39 questions, and it was all depending on responses to previous questions. We wanted to try and make sure that if we were sending out a survey to all of our staff, we're only asking the questions that are most relevant to them. So we had some questions that were dedicated to managers and supervisors, our clinical staff, our Indigenous workforce, I think even people working with data specifically. So based off of how people responded to previous questions, we made sure that they only saw the questions they needed to see. And I think a result of that upfront work is that we got a really good response rate out of it. About 42% of the workforce responded to the survey, which if you worked in workplace engagement surveys, 42% is great. We had a little bit of a competition between myself and Lori. I wanted to get about 30%. Lori wanted to get at least 50%, and we met in the middle. We got 42. Another big project was the policy and document reviews. So basically identifying any relevant policies or any other foundational documents where we didn't necessarily have a formal policy in place, and then reviewed those policies and documents against the standard criteria and guidelines to see how well they were aligned with the standard. We tapped into our internal policy team to help identify some of those policies for us. They were actually really keen and wanted to participate more in the actual analysis process, but we didn't have a whole lot of time. And I think in the future, that's something for us to tap into as our internal resources there. But a few members from our project team who are really engaged in the policy side of things reviewed all of the policies and documents. Probably the biggest part of the data collection efforts were the interviews. So we had interviews with staff in key roles within the organization who could provide in-depth insights into our alignment on the specific domains of the standard. So these interviewees were mostly identified from the CCMIA Change Champions as being potentially people who we could talk to. And we also kind of used a snowball sampling method where we would go and talk to our interviewees, say, hey, who else in the organization should we get to speak about this? They provided some great recommendations, but honestly, the Change Champions being such a broad group within the organization identified almost everybody that was mentioned as potentially being somebody by our interviewees as someone to tap into. So we had really good coverage, I think, from that process. Ultimately, the interview process took place by sending out emails to the interviewees, asking them to participate. And in those emails, we included the questions we were going to ask. So we gave the interviewee the opportunity to basically respond by email if they wanted. Some people aren't as comfortable in a Zoom or a Teams chat and would rather just respond by email. We also gave them the opportunity to meet with a member of the project team and a CCMIA Change Champion committee member to just talk things through, talk about those questions, or do both. And we had people from throughout the organization who picked basically every method possible of sharing that information with us. No matter the method that was used, we sent the information back out to our interviewees after we collected it all to make sure that they had a chance to look over the questions and their responses again, provide any information that they may have missed or make any corrections if we didn't quite understand things the right way. We just wanted to make sure that we were being as accurate as possible in the information that we were receiving. And then finally, we had the existing data. Again, most fun to me being the data analyst. We basically tried to tap into as much data that we already had available to us. So looking at like virtual doctor of the day surveys, our quality care and safety office, our complaints and compliments process to see if there was any themes that we could tap into, health benefits surveys, our nursing data, basically anywhere we could, we tried to answer with the information that we already had available to us. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Awesome. So once we had all of the data collected, we then collated it by criteria. So for each of the criteria of the standard, we took all of the information that we gathered and put it all together. We then assigned 2 reviewers from the project team to review all of the data per criteria. So we had 2 reviewers assigned for each criteria, and then they would go through and review the data, basically step by step. The first reviewer would create a summary of our alignment based on the data that was available, and reviewer 2 would provide feedback and edits. Basically, once this summary was created for each of the criteria, the reviewers worked together to come to an agreement regarding the summaries, and then they would determine where FNHA sat on for each of the criteria on a continuum of progress. And if you go on to the next slide, this is the continuum that we developed. So throughout this assessment process, we knew that a dichotomous approach where we say we've either met or we haven't met a criterion of the standard wasn't going to work very well in terms of aligning with cultural humility. The process of cultural humility is exactly that. It's a process. Simply saying we've met something or didn't meet something doesn't recognize that. So we wanted to make sure that we were reflecting that. We were working through, as an organization, a process of cultural humility and being culturally safe. And we needed to have a good measure of where we were sitting in that process. So knowing a new tool was needed to measure our cultural humility journey, we developed the cultural safety and humility continuum to be used in the reports that we created. And there are 4 stages, which you're seeing right now. And I'm going to make sure I read them exactly as they are, because I don't want to get the wording wrong. So the first stage, we've planted the seeds. So in this case, leadership is aware of the need to align with the criterion of the standard. However, there is no or very limited action towards meeting the criterion descriptions or guidelines. So we're just getting started, basically. The next stage is we are taking root. So the organization or organizational leadership has initiated processes to align our policies, standards, procedures, and workplace actions with the criterion. However, it is likely that progress towards alignment would stop if resources or priorities shift. So we see this as a plant who is just starting to take root. And it's really important that you're nourishing this plant during this process. If you take away the resources necessary, you take away the water, the sunlight, the nutrients, the plant's going to die. All of this hard work is gone. And we saw that this could potentially happen within our workplace efforts to align with the standard. There are some areas where we are still very vulnerable. If we're not putting in those resources, then we wouldn't continue in a good way. The next is we're starting to flower. So this is where we saw that the organization or the organizational leadership has made substantial steps towards alignment with the criterion of the standard. The organization is meeting the criterion description, but may not be meeting some aspects of the guidelines. So in this case, this is where if you really needed to dichotomize it, we're starting to meet it. We're starting to meet the criterion. We're starting to meet the description. We might not be meeting all of the guidelines, but we're heading in a very good direction. And then finally, there's the stage of we're flourishing in the meadow. And this is where the organization's policies, standards, procedures, and practices fully meet the criterion within the standard. And we're a role model in cultural safety and humility. So we have strong foundations for the organization to be a leader in cultural safety and humility across the healthcare system. So in this case, we are doing very well. We have aligned ourselves well with the standard. If anything, we're going further than the standard, and we are working towards being a role model. In this case, we can dedicate resources to supporting the people around us, supporting the organizations around us in their own journeys, and actually just working towards the whole system in this case. Now, it's really important to note, though, that even when we indicated that we were flourishing in the meadow, our cultural safety and humility journey still requires a great deal of attention, commitment, sunlight, care, water to continue to grow. Right? With this analogy, there isn't an end date of cultural humility. Rather, we're still on our journey, and there's still going to be work to be done. So even if we think we're flourishing, we still need to maintain, we still need to commit. We also provided recommendations for all of the criteria where we were sitting on those first 3 stages of the continuum. And we also had a few recommendations for that flourishing stage at the end as well. Just because we thought we were doing really well and that we were being role models didn't mean that we couldn't make some recommendations where we could improve still. These were basically recommendations for areas where we could start implementing some change, start kind of fostering further growth within the organization. And these are recommendations that were often informed by the interviewees who were experts within their own department. They recognize where work could be done. They recognize where the strengths are and how we can leverage those strengths moving forward. Now, the quality and the cultural safety and humility teams within FNHA are currently in the process of our prioritization steps for these recommendations that are going to help guide our next steps towards actually working towards improvement across all of the areas of the standard. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Awesome. So this is an example of what it looks like in the final report that we created. So for every criterion of the standard, we had a summary statement, which we can't share with you right now. That's where you see that kind of blue box sitting there. We've created those summaries for every single area of the standard, but They're still internal for us right now. We need to figure out if and how we share that information with the wider healthcare community in the future. But this is kind of what it looks like. And if you go on to the next slide for me, you can see an area where we're not necessarily flourishing in the meadow in this case, we're just starting to flower. And I can promise you there are other examples where the seeds are just planted. It's not like FNHA is leadership in every single aspect here. There's definitely room for us to grow in various stages. So this is just an example of where we're starting to flower. Again, can't share the summary with you right now, but we had a recommendation that we had for this one. So you can see what those recommendations look like. They're basic statements for now as we figure out how can we action on these recommendations moving forward. Can you move on to the next slide for me? Thank you. All right, so with that final report complete, we're now moving on to the next steps of our project, which includes discussions with executive leadership, which are coming up very soon. And Lori and I are starting to get stressed about it, I think it's fair to say. We have a lot of work to do. We're working on trying to find ways to disseminate these findings back to all staff. It was ultimately the FNHA workforce that contributed all of the information. We want to make sure that our findings are getting back out to the staff as well. And then we're going to move on to working on improving our alignment over time. In addition to these internal processes, we've had many requests from our partners to share our approach with them. Not necessarily the findings, but at least the approach, which is part of what we're doing here. So we're really happy to see how much interest there have been in taking this more relational approach. And we're trying to share this information to support others wherever we can. We're really happy to be here presenting with the UBC Learning Circle, and that the recording will be available for the public to come and reference some of this information. And we are working on publishing more about this, including that methods table in the near future, so others can take on similar work. Next slide, please. So there are a couple final things that we wanted to bring up because we thought our process wasn't perfect. We know that. Anytime you undertake a process like this, there's something that we could learn from. So a few of these points that we're hoping that other people and organizations consider when they move forward with their own processes. In order to do this well, you need dedicated time and human resources. It's worth the investment. You need to put the time in, you need to put the human resources in to make sure that you can really take on a project of this magnitude. We're hoping that the resources that we're trying to get out there are going to make it easier, that it won't be as much work for everybody, but it will still take time and effort. We also wish that we included Elder Wendy in the process from day one. Wendy helped us frame the project in the right ways. And so our recommendation is bring elders into the process right from the get-go. Make sure that you're touching on the important aspects right from the beginning and you don't have blinders on in places that you're not aware of. It's also really important to clarify the scope of the project in the early stages. You can take on the self-assessment even further than where we went with it. You can go like sky's the limit with what you can potentially do with this. So you basically need to know how far you want to take this project so that you can plan your resources accordingly. That's going to determine how much time, how many people that you get involved in this process. And a big one is providing as many opportunities for your staff to participate in this process as possible. We did not anticipate the high degree of interest within FNHA, and we wish that we had more avenues for discussion with the participants. Our participants wanted to contribute more of their ideas of how we could improve as an organization, and we didn't really have strong avenues to collect this information. We did our best to collect it wherever we could, and that was really what informed those recommendations. However, if we were to do this again, and the plan is to keep repeating this process so we can track our progress over time, we need to try to build in these avenues right from the start so people can share as much as they can and want and to provide their perspectives. Next slide, please. Awesome. And finally, we have some kind of things that we're asking of you for what you can do to kind of start this work. Sharing the documentary that we shared just to increase awareness, sharing the this presentation once it's up on the website, just getting more awareness. That's what we want. And start using the tool as using the standards as a tool for self-reflection and not just treating it like a checklist. There's often organizations that will go out there and they see the standard as something that they're there to meet. And we really don't think that this standard is something that you can simply meet. It is a self-reflective process of where you are along this journey. And we think that it's really important that organizations treat it as such. It's also really important to celebrate what you're doing well. Identify the strengths and use those strengths to continue growth and development in areas where you're not doing as well, right? Those strengths are incredibly important and you need to leverage them wherever possible. One of the biggest strengths within FNHA that I noticed was just how invested people were in this process. And I think that's something that we can leverage going forward because we want to implement processes to improve our alignment. And knowing that there's a huge portion of the organization that's willing to support that is a big first step. I also encourage you to encourage your health partners to work on this themselves and to work with you in this process. We all have leverage within this healthcare system to influence the partners around us, right? If they see that we're taking things on that we think are important and treating them as important as they are, that encourages them to treat it as important as we probably think they should be treating it. And lastly, get in touch with us if you'd like support with tools, presentations, or if you have any questions. We want to try and share this information out as much as possible. If you have any suggestions for where we can share information that will best get it out to you, let us know. We're doing our best we can within our internal processes to share as much as we can. So we want to make sure the avenues are available for us to share it with you. And I think if we go on to the next slide, we have time for questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. It was really great to learn about what you guys are doing with cultural safety and humility. And we have quite a few questions here, so I'll just get right into it. So our first question is, what year was the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard introduced?
2022.
And then our next question is, how can we access a copy of the standard? And is it quite costly? And how can it be implemented by everyone with such a high cost?
Yeah, totally. So great question. We get asked that question a lot. I've actually just popped into, I'll put it in the chat as well, but I've just popped it into the like question and answer response as well. So the standard is free for all BC health organizations and Indigenous communities and organizations. And so there's a promo code that you need to use to be able to get a free access to it. So it'll show up as costing $119. But if you use the promo code BC_HealthOrgs 2022 ! It should give you free access. And if you can't, for whatever reason, use that access code, feel free to reach out to us and we can just send you a PDF. It's Health Standards Organization that puts the cost on the website. And so we share it as much as we can within their requirements.
Cool, thank you. And then our next question, this participant just says, this is such great work. And they're wondering what internal capacity was required to implement the evaluation. And they would like to see something like this extended to students in healthcare programs like nursing, social work, medicine. Would it be interesting? It would be interesting to see how the programs are doing in implementing cultural safety and humility.
Yeah, great. I'm glad there's so much interest. And I think a method similar to this could be used across many organizations. And the joy of this method is that it's intentionally supposed to change over time and really be reflective of what each organization and each group needs for their own evaluation. So that's fantastic to hear. In terms of the internal capacity, so we didn't really anticipate that this was going to be such a big project. So in terms of internal capacity, there was nobody that was fully dedicated to this project. I was the closest to that, and I have many other projects that I work on. And so I think what we did is when we calculated the amount of time, we had a project team of about 5 people, but they were all working off the side of their desks and basically just doing me a favor because I couldn't do this work on my own. So I think when we calculated what we thought was the full-time equivalent hours, it was about 3 FTE for the 10-month process. But that was just the project team. And then we had the CSMI Change Champions. I think there was about 25 of them. And they, again, were only working with us for a few months, but they dedicated a lot of their time to the work.
Thank you. And our next question we have for the interviews, how did you foster a safe environment for people to share their honest feelings and experiences in those interviews?
Yeah, so that was really important to us because without people being honest, the interviews don't have a lot of value, and this is such personal work. So what we did was we made sure that we provided all of our information, like all of the questions that we were going to ask beforehand via email. And we also included the 2 people that they were going to be interviewed with. So there was a project team member and a CSMIA Change Champion member that did the interviews together so that we could make sure that it was conversational, but still taking detailed notes. We also didn't record the interviews, and we went back and forth on that a lot because obviously for recording purposes, it's better for accuracy, but at the same time, we A, didn't have the capacity to actually transcribe any of those recordings, and B, didn't want people to feel like if that recording got out, they wouldn't feel comfortable with what they shared. So we didn't record them. We just used notes, and then we provided those notes back to individuals so that they could make sure that they were validated and kind of resonated with what they were trying to say. And we also had really clear templated emails that went out that said like how we're going to be using this information, how we're going to keep it confidential. And the project team were the only people that saw the final information with the actual names on it. That's not as part of the report, nor is even the like department that the individual worked for. It's very much as anonymous as we could make it. Anything to add on that, Alex?
I think one other thing to add is we gave participants the opportunity to basically say, don't record this. There are some instances where they respond to a lot of the questions, and then we'd ask, okay, is there anything else you want to share? And they would say, don't write this down, but here are some things that I think are really important and are being missed. And we would take that information, we wouldn't write it down, but we would consider it for, okay, how do we get this information from other ways? Like, how can we investigate this further? So we're still getting the sense there, but we're not relying on a person to say something they're not comfortable with. In most cases, people were incredibly comfortable just sharing the information. We did have maybe 1 or 2 instances where we sent back the notes from an interview, and then the respondent said, this is great. Can you take out this 1 sentence? I don't think it should be in there. And we said, perfect, we'll take that out. And so we tried to, as best as we can, basically whatever the participant wanted to say, that's what we recorded. If they didn't want something recorded, we pretended either it didn't exist or we just didn't write it down.
And we also allowed people to either do their interviews in groups or as individuals. So for example, if I had been identified as an individual who should have been responding to questions by the CSMIA Change Champions, we would send an email to me, which obviously we didn't, but anyways, that's a bad example, but we would send an email to me and then say like, if there's anybody else that you feel comfortable including or that you think will be able to answer these questions better, feel free to bring them in. And so I think that really helped because people felt like they could bring safe people into their space. Or if we were reaching out to multiple people, there was occasionally instances where they said, I'm happy to meet with that larger group, but I also want to have an individual conversation with you. And so, of course, we respected that as well. And we just tried to be as flexible as we could.
Great. And then our next question is, So there has been a lot of research done to improve services. We're just wondering, how will you ensure the recommendations will be implemented? Much like the TRC, a lot of work and words, but slow progress, if any.
Yeah, such an important question. So we are really dedicated to making sure that the recommendations and this work does move forward within our organization. Unlike the TRC, of course, it's a little bit easier because we are our own organization and we're implementing our own things. We are meeting, like Alex said, with our executive team later this month, and we're actually prioritizing all of our recommendations to make it easier for them to know, like, these need to be done immediately. These can wait 6 months. We have various criteria that we're prioritizing against. And so, like, urgency, complexity. I can't remember the third one. Alex can remember, hopefully.
I think it's potential impact.
Impact. Yes, thank you. Urgency, impact, complexity. Thank you. And then also, if any of this work has already started. So for some situations, there's actually, like, we've recommended something, but there are teams already working on it. So hopefully some wins there as well. And then the hope is that every 5 or so years, we do the same evaluation again, and then we can measure the changes over time.
Great, thank you. And then our next question is, can you speak to whether or not you considered including the people FNHA serves in this process? And if decided not to include them, can you speak to some of the thinking behind this? If you did include them, how and where were they included?
Yeah, thank you. We considered this so much and we had many, many conversations about it. Alex, do you want to start on this one? You do it better than I do.
Sometimes, and then sometimes you do it better than me. So team effort here. This one was a struggle right from the get-go. We strongly believe that we're not going to know that we are being culturally safe in the services that we're providing until we're being told that we're being culturally safe, right? The clients of our service providing units, they're ultimately going to be the ones who tell us that our services are culturally safe. But there's a lot that can be done before that. We're still listening to our clients. We're listening through the avenues that we have, and we tried to touch on some of that through our existing data. But we're not really in a place right now to say all FNHA clients is receiving services. Are we being culturally safe? How are we doing on these different aspects of the standard? When we could take that first step and look at it ourselves. So we took this as a self-assessment. We've recognized areas where we need to improve, right? And that's something that we can do. That's something that we can address. Once we're in a place where we're comfortable, okay, internally, we feel that we're providing services as culturally safe as possible, then that's another conversation to have. Is like, is this actually being translated into client outcomes? Like, are clients feeling comfortable with the services that we're providing? And that's going to be a large project on its own in the future. But this is an important first step in terms of just looking at ourselves with a critical lens and being honest with ourselves before we start going out and surveying people that, and we know we're not going to be perfect. Right. And there's stuff that we can do to help become better. And that's what we need to do first.
Yeah. And in addition to that, there's a resources issue. So we had great ideas about how we could include people who accessed our services, as well as the First Nations Health Council and First Nations Health Directors Association. But as we mentioned earlier, we were working on like 3 FTE at most, and had a very short timeline to complete this really thorough evaluation. And so we had to really limit our scope just to be able to do what we were going to do as well as we possibly could within that time frame. And certainly wanted to include more of like a patient voice throughout, but it just wasn't feasible for the purposes of this project at this time. Also, it's important to recognize that a lot of FNHA staff are First Nations people who are accessing services. And so we were receiving some of those stories and pieces of feedback from their perspective even though we weren't directly asking them as patients.
Thank you. Our next question is, can you provide an example of how these standards resolved an incident of Indigenous specific racism?
I think the answer is no, I can't provide an example right now. How it's resolved an incident of Indigenous specific racism. I don't know if the resolution of like specific incidents is what the standard is going to be able to change. It's more the systemic pieces. Yeah, I don't know, Alex, if you can think of a specific example.
Could you ask the question again, just to make sure I'm
Yep.
understanding it right?
Can you provide an example of how these standards resolved an incident of Indigenous specific racism?
Okay. I can't provide a specific example. And I don't think the standard is really designed for specific instances. What I think the standard is better designed for is ensuring that we have systems in place to address issues of Indigenous specific racism when they arise. So there are multiple aspects of the standard. There are different criteria and different domains of the standard that address issues of Indigenous specific racism within the workplace, as well as issues of Indigenous specific racism in client service provision, and making sure there's avenues in place to address those, right? So having a client complaints and compliments process and the structures around that, critical incident reviews. So looking in clinical settings, if there's issues of Indigenous specific racism, how are they being addressed through internal processes? On the employee side of things, what does it look like in terms of resolution? Like what policies are in place for, in our case, like a respectful workplace, and specific anti-Indigenous racism policy, and then what are the avenues for, I think there's a specific one asking, like, what are the potential outcomes of that process? So looking at our HR disciplinary processes and what that looks like and how those are developed in collaboration with community, if they are, right? So it's more of a systems kind of level thing. It's not looking at like a specific pathway for a particular individual, but the intent then is that if you're aligned with the standard, that pathway should be strong.
Yeah, thanks. And our dear friend and colleague, Adam Finch, has put in the chat, who knows the standard like the back of his hand as well. And he summarized all our ramblings here very nicely. He said, I believe the standard asks if an organization has a mechanism for feedback from when people or from the people they serve, rather than being a tool to assess the feedback itself. So again, not looking at those specific instances. But yeah, thanks, Adam. You said it well, as always.
Thank you. And our next question is, how do we encourage forward movement with the ever-changing landscape in health, using hospitals, for example, resources, time, political, climate change are challenges that are often become a barrier?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So, of course, there's always going to be barriers. I think if we learned anything during COVID, it's that if we need to, we can overcome the barriers if things are urgent, and things are urgent. So we know within plain sight and with the stories that we've heard from Indigenous patients in BC for many, many, many years that this is urgent, that we try and improve the cultural safety of our system. And so I think some of those resources will be added when the urgency is really like considered fully. I also think that one of the barriers that you didn't mention, but I think is really like what the standard addresses specifically, is people often say like, well, we don't know how to improve our system. And so there is no reason to say that anymore, because now this wonderful Indigenous-led technical committee has said, here are 92 ways that you can improve the cultural safety of your system. And so if that becomes a barrier, then we can show them the standard and say like, no, but here's the list. We're telling you exactly what to do to improve your system. Please do it. And it is on the responsibility of the system, not the Indigenous people, receiving the services or even working within the systems to change. It's the responsibility of the rest of us to make those changes.
And our next question is, how were staff, change champions, committee members acknowledged or compensated for their time to support this work? Was it all volunteer, particularly for Indigenous folks involved? How was reciprocity built into this process?
Yeah, so we, all of the CCMI Change Champions were part of their, like, we're doing this work as volunteers, but as part of their roles at FNHA. So they were all being compensated through their regular salaries, and they were just provided the time from their managers to be able to participate, which we're very thankful for. We also made sure that they were provided with some gifts at the end during the ceremony, and kind of celebrated in that more cultural way with being blanketed. And that's how we tried to make sure that they felt supported. And yeah, just we had so much gratitude for them throughout this entire process.
Our next question is, what geographical area was interviewed, done, and collected data?
Yeah, so throughout all of BC. So I can't think of like a specific geographical area that would have been missed. And if it was definitely not intentional. Everybody had the opportunity to provide information.
Cool. Given cultural safety is determined by those who receive the service, how are you balancing the
bias,
system, I guess,
think?
bias, yeah, sorry. Yeah, for FNHA assessing cultural safety, how much is FNHA's self-assessment weighed compared to Indigenous staff and Indigenous partners?
Yeah, I'll pass to Alex in a second, but a self-assessment is going to be inherently biased, and we tried really hard to mitigate those biases to the best of our ability while still acknowledging that they existed. Maybe I'll pass to our research expert to talk a little bit more about what those biases were.
Yeah, for sure. It's there's definitely going to be some bias, right? Whenever you're conducting a self-assessment, something that's so personal as this as well, you're going to assume that there's going to be some bias in the way that people respond. To help mitigate that as much as possible, we tried to make the process as anonymous as possible, so that people felt as comfortable as they could to provide the information that they thought was the most truthful. Another way of doing it is, for interviews, we weren't just asking one person. We were asking multiple people within the organization across different regions too, in analogous roles. And if we saw something, and honestly, we didn't, we saw consistency pretty much throughout all of the interviews. But if we had a plan, basically, if we saw there was inconsistencies in the ways that people were responding, like if you have 4 people who are saying, yeah, we're really struggling in this one area and we need to work to improve this, and here's some recommendations how, and another person saying, this is great, there's nothing we need to change, then there was a bit of a check and balance that we could tap into to go, okay, something's inconsistent here, let's collect a bit more information and see what's the most accurate. So we tried to make like anonymous, asking as many people as possible to try and triangulate our way to the most accurate information, and then accepting the bias, right? Accepting that there's going to be a certain extent where we're going to say potentially we are doing better than we actually are, and acknowledging that that might be the case. And that's why we need to repeat this assessment over time, the self-assessment, to see, are we improving? Are we staying the same, or are we potentially getting worse? Like that will give us more information over time to determine, okay, maybe we weren't completely truthful the first time we did this. Now we have to work on that.
Totally. And I think that it's not just that we may have overestimated how well we're doing things. We very much likely overestimated or underestimated in certain circumstances, and thought that we were doing worse than we were, because we don't have eyes on the entire organization. If we had the ability to interview like 1,200 staff, we would have done it. But we don't have the time to do that or the resources to do that. And yeah, so the other way that we tried to mitigate it was by having mostly randomized pairs of people analyzing the data. so that we made sure that it wasn't just the same two people analyzing all of the data sets. And also I think that I don't think that we're going for perfection. And so as part of cultural humility, bias is like so important to recognize that it's going to be there forever and that we need to be able to work with the bias and around the bias as much as we can while addressing it really directly. So yeah, it's a great question though. We thought about that a lot. Our limitations section in our final report is lengthy.
Thank you. And has this information been shared with the BC health regulators?
Yes, and yes, mostly. Not all of them, but for example, the College of Oral Health Professionals has been really interested in this work, and so we've done multiple presentations to them at various conferences. And yeah, there's been a BC College of Nurses and Midwives has also had a lunch and learn about this process. So certainly, and dietitians. So certainly some, but not all. And we're always happy to do more presentations if it's helpful.
Great. Do you have a resource for cultural safety questions for a clinical questionnaire? Is it the standard? Is it in the standard?
Do you want to take that one, Alex?
So could you repeat that one again?
Yeah, yep, no problem. Do you have a resource for cultural safety questions for a clinic's questionnaire? Is it in the standard?
In the standard, no, not necessarily. We've developed some questions internally as part of the process that are targeted towards clinical providers within FNHA, but there's not really anything completely set in terms of what that would look like. Again, like if very FNHA specific in our instance. So we do have some questions that I'm hoping that we can share as part of that methods table in the near future that could potentially be drawn from. There's nothing really that's like a formal set list of questions. It would be really interesting though.
Next question is, do you see any links to the CSH practice standard introduced by the nursing and physician regulators in 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can probably put links to that in the chat as well, but they should be pretty easy to find. So yeah, the BC College of Nurses and Midwives and the College of Physicians and Surgeons have adopted those practice standards for cultural safety and humility. And there's definitely a lot of overlap. The BC Cultural Safety and Humility standard that we were talking about here today is much more detailed than those practice standards, but certainly overlapping in their intent. And we often, when I am presenting to the colleges, I'll often be kind of comparing those various documents.
Great. Is there a best contact person and where can I reach out?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that we have a general email address that is probably the best one to reach out to. Just I can put it in the chat. So FNHA standard or CHS standards at fnha.ca. Is it plural, Alex? Now I can't remember. We'll put it in the chat.
I'll look it up.
Okay, it's just general, so that we can all access it in case anyone were to leave. Yeah.
We have a question about promo code does not work for French version. Is there another code for that, or can we share the link to other people, and can we as individuals obtain a free copy or only organizations?
Yeah, super interesting about the French. I did not realize that until you commented, so thanks for that. I can follow up with HSO, the Health Standards Organization, on that question. So if you do want to reach out to us over email, then I can get that response to you as soon as I can. And then as individuals, can you receive a free copy? Yeah, so feel free to use the promo code, especially as if you're an Indigenous individual, that it's free for you as well. But we really do want this to be as low barrier as possible. So I won't be checking. Oh, what is the link for ordering this? Great question. I will put that in the chat as well. Just give me one sec.
And then our next question is, how does FNHA ensure that these standards are applied across departments within FNHA, in departments that provide their services to communities with HSOs externally, example, finance, including agreements, grants, processes, corporate services, and community services?
Sorry, I'm just trying to do too many things at once. How can FNHA ensure these standards are applied? So we're working with our executive leadership team to make sure that they're all champions of this work as well throughout their departments. And so I think what's really cool about FNHA is that there's actually so much interest from the leadership and the staff, that I think everybody's kind of on board already, which is, in terms of change management, a bit of a like weird position to be in because it saves a lot of work, but really thankful for that. And one thing that I can say is we actually have had a lot of people reach out. So for example, if they're developing new services or if they're developing new processes, they actually reach out to us and say, hey, we want to make sure that we're aligning with the standard before we create this new policy so that we don't have to change it in the future. So it's everybody's responsibility to be working on cultural safety and humility at FNHA, and hopefully every organization. But we're definitely seeing that that's happening throughout our organization already.
Our next question is, do you recommend alignment to pieces of this standard if your organization does not provide services?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually just had a conversation with an organization yesterday that doesn't provide clinical services, and we think that there's so much of the standard that can still be applied, and at the very least can be self-assessed, so that you can figure out where you have some gaps where you can improve over time. So of the 8 criteria, the 8 sections of the standard, I would say that like most of them are relevant in some way even if you don't provide clinical services. And same with like if you don't provide, or if you don't do research and evaluation, like you may not have to look at that section. I would encourage you though, because there were things that we thought that we might not apply to FNHA. And then when we actually looked through it and had conversations about it, we realized that every single one of them applied in some way. We just maybe had to modify it. So I would definitely encourage, even if you think that like the section about quality care of services or safety of services isn't relevant to your organization, I would still look in that section, because I'm thinking of, or there's some components about like how you compensate elders, which I think would be really important for all organizations, even if you're not providing clinical services.
Great. And what are the current plans and hopes for ongoing evaluation? And will you do the same process on a regular basis, or are there other embedded evaluation processes to monitor progress?
Yeah, so our hope is that FNHA will do this process every 5-ish years. So potentially starting at year 4 and then moving into year 5. We don't want it to look the exact same every time, because that means we're not learning from what we've learned over the last 4 or 5 years. So like I said, there was definitely many limitations that we ran into, and we want to make sure that in future evaluations, we're not making the same mistakes again, or not missing the same things, having the same blind spots. So yeah, I mean, obviously we want it to be as consistent as possible for the purposes of being able to look at our baseline data and like comparing the two, but also not wanting to become stagnant in how we do this work. I think there's also going to be some processes embedded around evaluation as we go along. So for example, with our next step of this project, the hope is that we have various like alignment projects that will follow a change management and a quality improvement methodology. And so within those templates that we've put together, there's actually some like ongoing monitoring of improvement that will happen project by project as opposed to a full evaluation. And one more thing, hoping that we can not need 10 months next time we do this, because we have all of the tools developed. So we're hoping that it'll be it will be a lot easier if we can do it the next time.
Great. And this will be our last question. We do have a few other questions unanswered, but just in respect to everyone's time, this will be our last question. Are there any big lessons learned that we should be aware of that we can put at the forefront of this work as we are looking to bringing these standards forward.
Go for it, Alex.
I think we touched on quite a few of them in one of the slides. So I would cross-reference back to that one once we get the presentation posted. We thought long and hard about those kind of key takeaways, the lessons that we learned, and I think they're pretty well reflected there. I think there's more that we're going to be looking into in terms of hopefully publishing that open access article sometime in the near future. We have some key learnings. But I think the big one is learning the scope, like taking the time at the beginning to learn the scope, figure out where you want to go with it, and then resource that adequately. Don't treat it as something that you can do off the side of your desk, even though that's basically what we did. Put the resources forward, make sure that you're putting the care and attention into it. It's really important. We came into it thinking it was really important. And then there were multiple times when Lori and I would have a meeting, we're going like, this is really important, like more than we thought before. So treat it with the respect it deserves. Treat it with the respect that you deserve too, in taking this process on. So that's probably the biggest lesson learned that I can think of off the top of my head right now.
And also don't be afraid to just start, because I think that's what kind of blocks a lot of people from doing this work, is they open up the standard and go, whoa, this is overwhelming, and then close it again. Yes, it's overwhelming, but even if you were to just look at 2 of the criterion in the standard, you're still doing work that's important. And so just start, take little bits at a time. We were building the plane as we were flying it. We had no idea how this was going to actually look in the end. And a lot of the barriers that we thought we were going to run into actually weren't barriers at all, because the standard was like well designed and everybody was so engaged.
Great, and I will hand it off to you guys to do any closings, and then once you're done, I will close out the learning circle.
Amazing, thank you so much. I believe Inez has joined us again to help us close out in a good way.
Hi, everybody. What a wonderful discussion, and lots of really great questions as everyone's reflecting on how this might look moving forward, and how it might look in everybody's respective practice areas. So just want everyone to take a moment to ground themselves and gather their thoughts and their energies in this good discussion, and reflecting on how they want to take this into their hearts and their practice and their lives moving forward, because I think it has so many applications outside of our work, has applications on how we approach ourselves, our families, our work, and how we relate to one another in a good way. So with that, asking you to pray in your own good way. Good grandmothers, good grandfathers, creator of all good things, Sky World, Star Nation, we thank you for this day. Thank you for this good time and the strength to come together and listen and learn and share, as everybody has put together their minds and Let's-a-Mot, one heart, one mind for learning, Let's-a-Thala and one heart. So we ask you that everyone goes on their way to their day in a good way with safety, to get to wherever they're going, to meet their colleagues, their families in a safe way. And I say that with all my relations. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to all our guests and to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Lori, Alex, Inez, for the amazing discussion. It was great to learn about cultural safety and humility and the standards that you guys developed. So just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming UBC Learning Circle webinars. We have Indigenous Health Administration and Leadership Program on February 8th at 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Please sign up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All these webinars are free to sign up for on our website at www.learningscircle.ubc.ca. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next Learning Circle. Limlit, thank you.